Welcome to How Is This Legal? Where in each episode we crack open the books to find outlandish legislation and regulations that make you ask, how is this legal? If you like what you hear, please be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with your family and friends. Here to break down what these laws mean to you is your host, Kyle Lorraine.
All right, and here we go. Justin, thanks for coming back again. I know we had some technical difficulties the last time. Little operator error on my part.
Yeah, no problem. Just don't do it this time.
I'll try my best. So the other day you mentioned something about some Southern Illinois current events. So for those of you that don't know, we go to law school at Southern Illinois University School of Law. You mind sharing that case? Because the facts were pretty bizarre.
Yeah, it's not really relevant to what we're talking about today, but it's interesting law, and that's what this podcast is all about, in my understanding. So the name of the case is Green versus Quick, and basically this is a case coming out of the Southern District Federal Court for the state of Illinois, and the plaintiff, Jade Green, brought the case against her mother and stepfather, along with the state's attorney and sheriff in Lawrence County, Illinois. She alleged that the sheriff and the state's attorney conspired with her mother and stepfather to get her arrested on drug charges, I believe. It may have been theft. I'm not really sure what the charges were. But they conspired to get her arrested, and therefore, they were able to get custody of her daughter, which would be one of the defendant's granddaughter and the other defendant's step-granddaughter. So the state's attorney and the sheriff, they settled with the plaintiff for like $75,000, I think. But the interesting part to me is that she brought this action under the 1983 Civil Rights statute, which allows an individual to bring a claim against state actors for violating their civil rights. And up until this point, I was under the assumption that, this only applied to state actors. But it's interesting that here the court actually was able to apply it to the non-state actors because they conspired with state actors to do this act. And the other kind of interesting fact of this is that the damages arising from the suit against Jack Hauser and Angela Hauser, who happen to be the owners of the Disclosure newspaper, which is a tabloid sort of newspaper here in Southern Illinois, the judgment was $970,000 for punitive damages and loss of consortium, emotional distress, I believe.
Well, that's good. I mean, if they're have this conspiracy to get this lady's daughter taken away, they probably should have to pay something.
Oh, definitely, I agree. It's just kind of, you want to use a legal term of art, conscious shocking to see a $970,000 judgment for something that there wasn't actual, what we think of as tangible harm, I guess. There definitely was harm, don't get me wrong, but no personal injury or anything of that sort.
Sure. I'm sure they wanted a pretty big deterrent effect with that too, though, and I definitely think they got it with that judgment. Also, some interesting current events going on with the gun world. So as of recently, I don't know if you guys saw it, but Dick's made the announcement that they are going to raise their minimum age to purchase a firearm to 21, and they are also not going to sell assault rifles anymore, or what could be categorized as assault rifles. A lot of people are calling for Walmart to do the same thing, but they already did. In 2015, they discontinued the sale of assault rifles, and just recently they raised their minimum age to purchase a firearm to 21 as well. And little known fact, Kroger just did the same thing, and no, Kroger doesn't sell guns in any of their locations, but they do own a number of Fred Meyer locations, which I'm unfamiliar with. I'm assuming it's some kind of all-around type Walmart type store. But in Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, the minimum age to purchase a firearm in those stores is also raised to 21. So, kind of in light of what we were just talking about, slightly related, there's an individual that is bringing a claim against both Walmart and Dick's, alleging that it is a violation of, or it's discrimination because he is under 21. Was he 19 or 20?
Yeah, I think he's 19.
And he's not able to buy a gun because obviously he's not 21. So he's alleging age discrimination against these two corporations, which in the eyes of the law would be private actors. They're, obviously not controlled by the government or anything like that. So it's kind of interesting because it's somewhat of a reverse age discrimination claim.
Right, because typically when you see an age discrimination claim, it's persons over the age of 40. He's bringing this under an Oregon statute, which I'm not familiar with and haven't researched previous to this, but I'm assuming that this statute either isn't clear on what age can be discriminated against, what age group, or it has a provision explicitly allowing for a claim of discrimination on an age under 40.
And the decision hasn't come out yet in the Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission, and that's the case with the same-sex couple that went to this cake shop to try to get a cake for their marriage and were denied service by this cake shop, so they brought a claim alleging that it was discrimination and all these type of things. So obviously the one side of that argument is that the private actor, the cake shop, should be able to choose who they serve and should be able to deny people for their own reasons. And then the flip side of the coin would be that you shouldn't be discriminated against, especially for something like same-sex marriage, which is now federally recognized as legal from the Obergefell case. So it'll be interesting to see how the court rules on that, because I would assume it's going to have similar effect on this Oregon case with this guy that's bringing a claim against Walmart and Dick's. But I think that there's a lot of exciting things happening in the world of guns these days. Unfortunately, a lot of it is in light of these terrible events. So kind of wanted to preface this conversation by saying that we're not trying to downplay any of the recent shootings or anything like that. Most of the conversation here is going to be definitely leaning towards a strong reliance on the Second Amendment and to not strip away rights for gun owners and things like that. But just wanted to make it clear that it's not meant to sort of downplay or diminish any of the things that have happened recently. But I think the first thing that I kind of wanted to touch on before we sort of get into some of the laws and stuff like that is how your perception can be shaped based on what you know in terms of guns or how much you're related to them or associated with them. So, for example, I'm a hunter. I enjoy hunting. I don't get to do it near as often as I'd like, because usually whenever hunting season rolls around, it's finals or whatever else going on with school, and I've been in school for way too long now. But anyway, so with that knowledge, I've always understood and had a great respect for guns and the potential damage they can do. In Missouri is where I'm from, and where I hunt, you have to get a hunter safety card, or you have to go through a safety course. I think it's called a heritage card or something like that as the end result. But basically in this course, it teaches about, the importance of gun safety, the basic stuff that you might not learn if you're not around guns, which my family wasn't, because we didn't, nobody in my family was into hunting before I sort of took it up. So we didn't really have any guns before I got a rifle to hunt with and so on. So me and my dad went to this course, and it gives you like a basic breakdown of, like some of the terrible things that can happen if you don't, assume the gun is loaded. There's stories of people like pointing a gun at each other for fun, and somebody ends up dying, different things like that. But I think once you have, and Justin, you could probably comment on this too, once you have like a better understanding of sort of the power of a gun and how it relates to, or how it translates once you pull that trigger, there's no taking it back. The bullet is going to go at whatever you're aimed at and stuff like that. I think it gives you a better basis for not exactly, avoiding some of the things that are happening, but I think if people had a better understanding of sort of the capabilities of a gun and had a greater respect for them, it's much easier to not be so disconnected from the end result of maybe taking somebody's life or something like that. Because if you see the real effect, you're shooting targets, or you go hunting with it, you understand sort of, the A to B action, what happens, because it's easy to describe, but it's a lot different when you're actually using a gun and are more familiar with them. And I know you and your family have a long history with guns. You're into restoring them and shooting and stuff like that. So I was hoping you could comment on, do you think that argument, makes sense? Do you think people should know more about guns before they try to just say that we should get rid of them all?
Yeah, I think definitely. I think there's two different perspectives to look at here. I think one, if you look at it from the perspective of the perpetrator of these crimes, a lot of them have no prior experience with firearms, and so maybe they don't have the level of respect that, say, you or I do for firearms. I'm not saying that that's leading to their actions, but maybe that's a contributing factor, but definitely not the sole thing. The other perspective I think that we can discuss is that a lot of people who are anti-gun honestly are totally ignorant of how firearms work, current firearms laws on the book, everything to do with them. They just hate them, and they've never had any experience with them at all. So they don't understand that a bump stock doesn't turn a gun full auto. They don't understand that there's no such thing as fully semi-auto, and some of these other terms. We've even had legislators make comments that once we ban magazines, that we won't have any more problems because will have used up all the bullets in them, like magazines come preloaded. But I definitely think that in order to make a valid argument on how firearm law should be, we need to understand that. And I think that a lot of people on the anti-gun side do not have any understanding of that, or any understanding of the gun laws on the book. Recently, there was a lady running for Virginia legislature, I believe. I'm not sure if she was running for Senate or House or whatever, but she did a video on Facebook where she was going to destroy her assault rifle, or so-called assault rifle. And so it was an AR-15, and she proceeded to cut the barrel off at a length, converting the rifle into a short-barreled rifle in violation of federal law, actually committing a felony. So here you have this woman who's running for a political position, preaching that she wants to reform gun laws, yet she's completely ignorant of the gun laws that we have on the book. So how do you expect someone with that level of ignorance to create common sense, effective gun laws? And go ahead.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think I think it helps too if you have sort of, you understand the need for having a gun. So I used the hunting example earlier because there's a lot of people that go out, hunt their own food. They'll go elk hunting or they'll go deer hunting, and that might be the meat that they eat all year. And I think that the United States is almost it's almost too big for its own good when it comes to these kind of issues, because I have family members out in California that anytime these gun debates will pop up, it's always, they're quick to share the stuff on Facebook that's, hunting is for rednecks and stuff like that. But I think it's interesting because it's, those people or other people that are making this argument are probably in the 95 or 97% of the country that eats meat. And just because somebody goes out and kills their own meat and knows where it's coming from, that it somehow makes them a terrible person. I never quite understood that argument, but if you go buy a steak from the grocery store from a cow that was probably on a conveyor belt getting a spike shoved through its head, then you're a better person. So I think that when you have these people that live on really either coast, they have that sort of that superiority complex because you're born in a different zip code, then you probably know more about everything than everyone else. And it's easy to use the Midwest as kind of a scapegoat, even though we're the ones providing food and, different necessities for the rest of the country. But I think that if you don't have much of a need for one, you've never gone hunting, you don't live in an area where you're concerned about the police, having kind of where you live, if, you call the cops, it could be an hour before they show up.
Oh, absolutely. It will be an hour, not it could be.
So, and then just imagine if there's literally anything else going on, then that time just keeps growing.
Right.
So if somebody breaks into your house and they're trying to harm you or your family, you need a way to protect yourself. It's much different than living in New York or Los Angeles, where you have, so many more police officers. You have more people around you that could potentially protect you, and different things like that. So I think it helps to understand that, or to understand, or at least try to understand that there's a lot of people in this country that do have a bona fide need to have a gun. They could live by themselves in a rural area and need to protect themselves. Maybe they hunt food to provide for their family, or maybe they just enjoy shooting. It's something that's a hobby for them, and it gives them something to do outside of their 9 to 5 or what have you. So I think that's kind of the point I'm trying to get at here, is that there's a lot of argument from both sides on the issue, but I think that people should take a step back and try to understand why a lot of people feel so strongly about the Second Amendment and why they would like to retain their gun rights and so on.
Yeah, and I just to expand on that, I mean, not only to mention hunting, there's a lot of shooting sports people engage in, IDPA, 3-gun, all sorts of shooting events that people just engage in for fun, just like golfing or whatever else you may enjoy. People collect firearms. For me personally, firearms represent a lot more than a tool or something capable of shooting a bullet. They represent a lot of history and a lot of effort, a lot of craftsmanship that people over the generations have put their effort into creating something that's more than just a tool. And the heritage that comes with firearms. I mean, lots of families have firearms that have been passed down for generations, and as an heirloom, they represent something that just isn't quite as achievable with so many other items. But I think all of these things that we're discussing are collateral to the actual reason that the Second Amendment was put into the Bill of Rights, and that the right to own firearms is something that is so fundamental to our concept of ordered liberty, and that's just rooted in history and tradition of the United States. And that stems from the fact that the United States was created because individuals felt that they were not being fairly ruled over by English rule. And so what did they do? They fought that tyrannical government with firearms. And so they felt that that was so important that they explicitly put that into the Bill of Rights. And even if we did not have the Second Amendment in the Bill of Rights, I think it's such a fundamental right to have for any concept of ordered liberty. It's rooted strongly in tradition and history of this country, and even country before, the country we came from, or multiple countries. And it's so essential to the existence of any other rights. Sure, it's nice to say we have a First Amendment right, of speech, of religion, and all these other rights that we are given. But if we don't have the individual power to make sure that the government does not refuse to allow us to enjoy those rights, then those rights are meaningless.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And when you look at sort of going back to the history, not just the United States, but if you look at Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia, the first thing that a tyrannical government will usually do is disarm the population, and thus making it impossible for them to defend themselves, when the government is trying to take over and trying to strip the other rights. So, yeah, I completely agree. It's definitely something that is the brick and mortar for the rest of the Constitution. I know a lot of people probably say that we're, conspiracy theorists or wearing the tinfoil hat over here, but I don't think it's that far-fetched that if you have, the government does grow in power throughout the years and throughout the decades, maybe throughout the months, I'm not really sure. But if you let it get to a certain point and then they take away your power to sort of fight back or to have a way to protect yourself, then you really run the risk of having a government just completely take over and change the way that this country operates in the matter of, a few days or a few weeks if no one can fight back. But I do think that, in the same vein, I think that it's important to have some sort of common sense gun regulation, not necessarily a total ban on the assault rifles, because in all honesty, it's not going to do much for the total homicide rate. Do you have the numbers for the 2016 or 2015 for the FBI statistics from the murders?
So the latest completed FBI statistics are from 2016. They just had the preliminary report from 2017. So your total number of homicides in 2016 were 15,070. Of those 15,000, 11,004 were committed with firearms. But what's interesting is that 7,105 of those were committed with handguns. And interestingly enough, we have this category of firearms type not stated. I would be interested to know how this number gets so large that we cannot identify what type of firearms were used, because that category there is 3,077. In light of the identified types of firearms, my assumption is that a vast majority of those are probably handgun.
So why do you think it's unidentified? Do you think it's like a murder scene that they could never match up the mushroomed bullet, or?
Well, that seems like a weak argument because I'm not saying your argument's weak. I'm saying that
I'm just throwing one out there.
Right. But that probably is an argument that they have. If they can determine that a cause of death was from a bullet, they should have the means to identify the type of weapon that came from. Although there is some overlap with cartridges that will fire in both a rifle and a handgun, the vast majority of projectiles should be readily identifiable as coming from either a handgun or a long gun rifle. And of course, a shotgun is going to be readily ascertainable upon the examination of gunshot wounds and the projectile itself. So I haven't mentioned the numbers from those, but rifles, and keep in mind that the category rifles, it includes everything from a single shot 22 rifle, which requires reloading each time, and by reloading I mean manually either opening the gun and reloading it. It's a time-intensive thing as compared to just pulling the trigger. But that category includes those all the way up to fully automatic rifles. And the total for 2016 was 374. Shotguns was 262. Just to give some comparison, knives or cutting instruments, there was 1,604. Blunt objects, 472. And personal weapons, hands, fists, feet, etc., 656.
So yeah, like I was saying, if you get rid of the assault rifles, you're not going to do much to curb the overall homicide in this country, which, I mean, these numbers are huge if you have 15,000 people a year dying, but when you compare it to the 323 million or whatever the U.S. population is right now, it's not that much. I mean, not saying that it's acceptable levels and so on, but I know a lot of people, at least one of the arguments you always hear when this happens is we always get compared to like Norway or Finland or somewhere like that has the lowest homicide rate in the world. But you're looking at a country that has a few million people as opposed to 300 million people. So it's not comparable at all. And you don't have the same like concept of history and tradition with the firearms being, such a part of our culture in terms of, like getting rid of them and being able to control them better. So it really is almost impossible to compare the U.S. to really any other country when it comes to regulating stuff like this.
Well, especially in light of the fact that many of those countries with very low rates of homicide, especially gun violence, are so they're so homogeneous in regard to the characteristics of the population. Sweden, Switzerland, some of those countries. Some of them you mentioned?
I think Norway's.
Yeah. The population is very identical, and they don't have these social forces, which are contributing factors, I think, probably to violence, because people disagree about things when they come from different backgrounds. and where you have a country that everyone is so similar, it's less likely to happen.
That's a really good point, because I mean, we are the melting pot, and we obviously have a long history of racism being a problem in the country and different things like that. Not saying that's like one of the huge driving factors here, without looking at the data and being able to analyze that, but people will disagree, and especially when they're different on a, even skin color or anything like that. It's like if they could find some reason to disagree, then it seems to drive that a little bit more. So what do you think would be a good sort of, I guess, like, I don't want to use the word control, but something that would sort of curb a lot of the violence going on? Because I can't help but think that the emphasis on finding a way to ban assault rifles, like we said, isn't going to do much just statistically. But it also seems like we would get so much further if we had more of an emphasis on mental health, or sort of a uniform reporting system, where if you have, because I know like certain states, and we can get into this in a second, if you're arrested or accused of, some kind of domestic violence, or I think it's most often if you get arrested for domestic violence, at least here in Illinois, right, or something like that, then you can be banned from purchasing a gun for a certain amount of time.
Right, even just the filing of a order of protection.
Okay, that was it.
Yes.
That was the threshold.
Yeah.
So I think when you have stuff like this on the state level, I understand if like there's going to be people that use that, maliciously to stop someone from buying a gun, even though it's just, a disagreement and it's not to the level that they should need to be stopped from buying a gun, meaning that the spouse is disgruntled about something and just wants to put that forward, which you run into the issue of the whole, due process argument, like, why should I not be able to buy a gun without going through due process? But setting that aside for a second, I think that if we had some sort of uniform system where if, this happens, maybe we could have a different threshold. Say you're arrested for something like domestic violence or assault and battery, something along those lines, then maybe you probably shouldn't be able to buy a gun for, at least a couple weeks, until you cool down, or maybe get some help if you have some underlying sort of mental issues going on and stuff like that. What do you think about that?
Well, I definitely agree, and I think that the vast majority of firearm supporters, pro-firearm people, groups, they're definitely all for laws. And I don't want to say the expansion of laws. I think it's more of a fixing the laws that we have currently on the books with background checks, for instance, which is a common misconception that I've heard people have. Some people do not think that the purchase of a firearm from a dealer automatically requires a background check. But in all 50 states, the ATF federally requires that dealers perform a background check on the purchase of any firearm. And so, therefore, it's difficult to think that any expansion of gun laws is going to help when these gun laws that we have, because of the lack of proper execution, are not being effective. For instance, with the Parkland shooter in Florida, that individual had been reported many times for mental issues from an age as young as middle school. And it was clear that he had mental problems and had exhibited anger issues that he should not have been able to purchase a gun. And those reports were made to the FBI. But because of a problem with communication in that system, and between different agencies and the sort, there are instances such as this one where the background check is able to be passed. So I think that we need to begin with that, making sure that these agencies are able to communicate issues and that they take issues like this seriously. And along with that, the ability to maybe decrease the level of privacy protection that we give to certain mental illnesses and certain traits that are exhibited due to mental illnesses, in order to disallow those people to obtain firearms. I think that's the start. And as we talked about last time, another huge thing I think is a societal problem, and I think it's the lack of personal responsibility that just seems to be growing every year, and I think that contributes to firearm violence as well, and the push for firearm laws that, in my opinion, won't be effective because they aren't targeting the problem, and that's the people that are committing the crimes, not the guns that they're using to do so.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, especially with that last part. And I think that's sort of what I was trying to get to earlier with the whole sort of knowing the effects of a firearm or knowing how they operate and what they're capable of, because that it does more in light of personal responsibility if you're sort of aware, and it makes you less apt to be sort of disconnected from that issue. Um, so we have, as we mentioned earlier, we have Walmart, Dick's, and now Kroger that are raising the minimum age to 21. And there's obviously many private gun retailers that probably won't do that, because I was reading an article earlier, and there was this particular retailer, I believe it was in Virginia, that was talking about, Virginia or Pennsylvania is one or the other, that was talking about how they didn't really agree with the Dick's situation with them raising the age to 21. But on the same note, it does give them more business, because if people want to buy certain types of guns at the age of 18, if they want to buy a shotgun or whatever, then they're able to go into these places and buy them. So you have these small retailers that are able to do this. Obviously, Walmart was or not obviously, but unsurprisingly, Walmart was the largest gun retailer in the country, at least up until recently. I think they still might be. But so you have these big box places that are banning this, but then you still have the problem of people selling guns online, right? So could you explain a little bit about how the sort of identification or verification process works for buying a gun online, and does that system that for every state you need a background check, does that work with the online sales too? Like if I'm trying to buy from, say I'm trying to buy from Illinois and it's stricter over here, am I able to sort of bypass it by saying I live in Missouri? And how interconnected is it? I guess my question.
Absolutely not. I mean, in order to purchase a firearm online, that firearm is going to have to be shipped to a federal firearms licensee, a gun dealer in layman's terms. And the same procedure, same background check that applies if you walk into the store and buy one is going to apply if you buy that gun online and have it shipped to your local dealer. So the online loophole, so-called, or the gun show loophole, those are fallacies. And to be honest, the same applies to gun shows. If you go to a gun show and buy a firearm from a dealer, you still have to undergo background checks and whatever other relevant state laws that are imposed, such as in Illinois, there are waiting periods on the purchase of handguns and long guns, different waiting periods. But the gun show, the fact that they're purchased at a gun show does not change any of that procedure, nor does the purchase of them online.
And so what you're saying basically is that we pretty much have everything that everyone's kind of asking and advocating for already. It's just not working.
Right. And don't get me wrong, there is the potential in the private market, individuals selling guns, for there not to be any background check performed. But there's a couple things here. For one, I think we see a lot of the perpetrators of horrible crimes, mass shootings, such as the one at Parkland. Those firearms were not bought from individuals or on the black market. They were bought from gun retailers legally, following all the required laws and background checks. So, yeah, I think the problem is that the background checks are ineffective. And I along with the vast majority of firearm supporters, have no problem with basically requiring these agencies to do their job duly. I think it's of great importance that they are able to communicate effectively and quickly the information that is relevant to prevent someone to purchase a firearm. And I think there are other ways around it, or in order to accomplish it, such as a nationwide firearms owner identification card, certain things like that, which may have the effect of not only expanding your gun rights, because it may allow for you to be able to purchase guns in other states that you cannot currently, but it will also curb the criminal use of guns by preventing guns from being purchased by people who have criminal records or mental problems whatsoever.
I don't think that's I think that's a fine idea, but I think the problem is you have to look at sort of where they're gonna make the requirements for. So say like they pull the sort of the requirements from Illinois' firearm identification card, or maybe New York or California. I'm just using the three biggest cities in the country with New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. So like I wonder if if they pulled from one of those places that have tighter gun laws than the rest of the country. You know, if you're because I know Missouri, they're not as strict as Illinois. Right next to each other. So if you have them pulling it from one of these three major reformers in the gun control area, I wonder if that's going to strip a lot of the rights that people currently enjoy. Kind of saying where maybe the firearm advocates wouldn't be in favor of this.
Well, I think there automatically is kind of a tendency to be hesitant towards anything like that, especially anything that's federally governed. But my suggestion there is not that we adopt the laws of any one given state, but that there's some type of identification that allows people to know immediately that that person is eligible to purchase firearms, that they have no criminal record or no mental illnesses that would throw up a red flag to prevent them from getting a gun. And we don't have anything like that right now. I think it can be simplified and therefore more effective by using something as a card as opposed to having to require a background check every time. And basically what I'm talking about, it would be some type of system where you have a card that you scan like a credit card. Immediately it tells you whether that person is eligible or not to purchase a firearm. Once they're a known gun owner and they're someone that there are no red flags that come up on, I think a lot of the other laws become irrelevant, such as the waiting period. If we already know that someone is a gun owner, what indication is there, or what logic is there behind requiring them to wait to purchase another gun when they already own one? There's not a lot of difference in a bullet from gun A as compared to gun B. And so, I mean, they can accomplish, if they wanted to commit some horrible crime, they can do that with the gun that they already possess. There's no need to go out and buy one. And in fact, you'd be quite stupid to do so, because firearms are already one of the most traceable things on earth with with their serial numbers and the amount of recording that is done at the manufacturer, distributor, and dealer level. So, that's one suggestion I have to help with the amount of firearm crimes. And so we're talking about fixing the firearm crime problem. Well, I think I have mixed feelings, because I think that the amount of firearm crimes that occur, such as Parkland, Florida, they can be reduced for sure. I think there's things that we can do not only in background checks, but also in increasing security in our schools. But when we look at it, I don't want to give the perception that firearm crimes resulting in the deaths of individuals is some type of huge problem, that it's something that's new that we really need to worry about. There are more guns in the United States than there are people. So there are a lot of guns out there, and there are a lot of people that own guns.
And that's just the ones they know about, too.
Correct. When we look at the statistics, though, last year there was 11,000 homicides committed with firearms. Okay. By comparison, there are around approximately 268.8 million vehicles in the United States, less than the U.S. population. However, there were, according to the National Safety Council, in 2016, there were 40,200 deaths as the result of automobiles.
Yeah, and then, of course, the counter-argument to that is that, you need automobiles and they serve more of a quote-unquote legitimate purpose than a gun does and stuff like that. But I agree that there's so many guns out there, and there's so many illogical rules that are already in place with I wanted to comment on the waiting period thing. I've never understood that, because if you're already a gun owner, then why do you need to wait for another one? Because presumably you're going to buy something that's pretty much almost the exact same thing. And speaking of the amount of guns that we currently have in circulation, I was listening to a podcast the other day. It's called Mind Pump. They're a fitness podcast, but they were doing sort of a current events section. And they were talking about how people have discovered that they're able to use 3D printers to make guns that are very similar, almost identical to an AR-15 in looks and functionality. And they figured out they can make them out of polymer or metal. So what you have is a situation where if these 3D printers become cheaper and more readily available, which they will, because that's the way technology works. Once something's out for a while, it's cheaper and more people buy it. And before you know it, everybody has it. The TV and the computer are both great examples of that. But the really significant part of this is that the way that it's possible is through person-to-person file sharing, which is the same technology that is used for things like Napster or LimeWire or BitTorrent that enables people to share downloaded content with each other across the internet. And the government's been wholly inept at stopping that or even thwarting it to any degree. So if you have a situation where these guns are regulated more and these people already have a way to do it that the government can't stop, it kind of makes for the perfect storm.
Right, I totally agree. I mean, if you push people into that situation where they are not able to, within reason, obtain firearms that are regulated, then I think that people are going to take the route where they are more likely to want to manufacture their own firearms. And as you say, there's currently already technology that allows either polymer or metal manufacture of guns similar to or even identical to AR-15s and other semi-automatic weapons. And I think that the fact that if we put people in those situations, the evolution of that technology and investment in it is going to do nothing but grow. And what you're left with there is, sure, some really strict firearm laws on the book of regulated firearms, but then you're going to have this entire collection of firearms made at home that have no regulation over them because they're unable to be traced. It's something that someone can do and the government will never know about it. Whereas now we have where firearm manufacturers and distributors, dealers are required to comply with a vast amount of laws in order to keep firearms out of the hands of criminals.
Yeah, imagine if like a gang got a hold of one of these 3D printers and hired just about anyone that knows how to do it to make some guns for them. I mean, you would have like an entire potentially black market of guns. And what if there's like some small defect that after a certain amount of shots, the polymer model like breaks apart, and not only do you have the potential for guns out there, hurting the people that they're shooting at, but you also have a situation where these guns aren't manufactured properly, so they're blowing up in the operator's hand. And if they're looking so much identical as the original ones, or the ones that are manufactured in an actual facility, then who knows? Those could get into circulation at these gun shows and different things like that. But I can't help but think that like an organized crime application would be the one that I would be most worried about with this type of situation.
Right, and I'm glad you said that because that kind of is a good segue into the fact that of the approximately 11,000 firearm homicides that were committed last year, it requires us to extrapolate a little bit because the most recent data I have from the Center for Disease Control found that in 2010 and 2011, of the approximately 11,000 gun homicides, 8,900 approximately of those murders, were committed in relation to gang activity. So over 80% of gun homicides are gang related according to the most recent CDC statistics. To kind of add on to that, according to a study by Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public Health, partnered with the Pittsburgh Bureau of Police, a research of 893 firearms that police recovered from crime scenes. Of those firearms, 79% of those were not lawfully owned by the perpetrator, meaning that they were either obtained through some black market source or were stolen. 3% of those were unknown, and only 18% were what if, and in only 18% was the perpetrator the legal owner of the gun. So I think that shows that gang violence is a huge problem that we could be focusing on rather than firearm crimes and individual or firearm ownership and individual types of firearms in an effort to curb firearm crime. But you don't hear any bills coming up, addressing these issues or any policies or procedures to implement some type of, be it agency or whatever, to reduce gang violence.
Yeah, I'm starting to think that maybe the government and the people we have representing us are just bad at fixing anything that has to do with guns, because I know like in the 80s and 90s, there was a big push for sort of a control of gang violence with a lot of the three strikes laws and stuff like that. A lot of those were, in part at least, enacted to stop people that were habitual perpetrators from kind of roaming the streets. And I know a lot of it, the underlying motivation was gang violence. And I know in the media, especially in the mid to late 90s, there was a huge push for controlling gang-related activity. But it seems like it just got to a point where we can't control it anymore because, like we're saying, the overwhelming majority of homicides are taking place in relation to gang activity. So maybe that's aside from the obvious, children and people being affected in the school shootings and the shootings like Las Vegas and Orlando at the club and concert and things like that. Besides the obvious threat to people and a lot of people dying, maybe there's just such a frantic push and so much of an outcry for this because maybe people are worried that it's going to get to the situation where it's uncontrollable, kind of like the gang violence. And we're going to be in a situation where there's not much we can do, so we just focus on other issues. And our short attention span just lets us forget about it for a while until something pops up again. So, I mean, I kind of agree with both sides that, you shouldn't necessarily blame the gun because there's a person operating it. But on the same note, most people, probably including myself to a certain degree, want something to change, something to stick, sort of this time around before this becomes more of a problem and runs rampant like gang violence and does become uncontrollable.
Well, absolutely. I would agree, and I think the vast majority of people would agree, especially people who are law-abiding gun owners. The only issue that I think that law-abiding gun owners have when you start to increase regulations or change the firearm laws is that so typically, anytime firearm laws are allowed to increase, it's kind of like that saying that you give an inch, they want a foot. Anytime that you increase the level of regulation, the anti-gun crowd just wants to increase that more. And so I think that's a worry of a lot of them. A lot of people, they've seen it occur before, and so therefore it is very difficult to accomplish that. There are so many falsities in the media that have contributed to this idea that, first off, that mass shootings are some kind of ever-growing thing, and I do think there is some truth to that, but I think the media is partly to blame. Whenever a shooting like this happens, a mass shooting, such as the Parkland shooting, the media dwells on it, and they hyper-focus on it to an extent that I think that, as we've discussed before, it is a motivation for people who already have tendencies to be mentally unstable and such to go out and do the same thing because they feel like, the media is somewhat, I don't want to say celebrating, but the media is so focused on it that they are giving them like a spot in the spotlight. And so that, along with, as you discussed, it seems that legislators and the media alike don't want to focus on gang violence, even though it's an overwhelming majority of firearm violence in the United States. I think one of the reasons that it may be so complicated to not only for the media to broadcast on it, but also for the legislators to focus on the issue is because it is such a complicated issue. There are so many underlying factors that studies have shown lead to gang violence and the type of issues that occur maybe in areas of poor economic status and the like.
Yeah, I think it's easy. I think it's easy for us to comment on it and say what we don't agree with, but I couldn't even imagine trying to craft legislation to stop gang violence or anything related to guns.
Right, I agree to an extent because, as you say, or as we've both said, gang violence is something that's very difficult to legislate on. On the contrary, I think that there are common sense, simple gun laws that can be implemented and effectuate positive change on gun crime. But due to the ignorance of a lot of people on guns, I think that that's why it's not being accomplished, not because it's that really difficult of a question. Now, there are some things that are difficult, and we can never eradicate crime. And so, therefore, we can never eradicate gun violence. We can never eradicate violence with fists, it's impossible. But there are a lot of changes that we can do, increasing school security, increasing the efficacy of background checks in order to curb, especially this what the media portrays as a newly forming issue with mass shootings. And I agree that we need to thwart that and to decrease it, but I don't think that the media is doing that effectively.
Yeah, I don't think so either. And there's some studies or people that have commented on the media's use of sort of putting the person or the shooter's picture and name everywhere as a way for people that are in this very weakened and like low state of being in respect to their mental state. These individuals that are perpetrating these crimes are in such a spot that any sort of push or just the wind blowing in the right way is sort of enough to make them justified in their head that this is what they need to do in order to feel better. It almost gives them something to kind of identify with, as sad as that is to say. And I think that circles back to the whole argument about how mental health should be more of a priority. And earlier when I said that it would be difficult to craft legislation for this, I do agree that there's common sense approaches that we could take that would help to stop a lot of these problems, or maybe look at gang violence a little bit more to kind of figure out how to figure out some kind of common sense gun laws that can be applied to sort of everything else. I agree with that, but I think you have to qualify it too. I think it's difficult to make any sort of legislation that's going to make everybody happy, because I think this issue in particular is just so polarizing that you have the legal gun owners that don't want really any change, or any change that would be take an inch, give them a foot, or you offer an inch, they take a mile. And then you have the other side of the coin here that wants a complete overhaul. They want all the guns taken away and all these things, which neither of them are really going to happen. So I think it's difficult for really anybody in this position to make something that's going to satisfy everybody.
I would agree. A middle ground position is difficult, just as any legislation is difficult to accomplish. And especially if we add into the fact that legislators are expected to be able to legislate on such a wide variety of issues. I mean, it's somewhat blind to expect all legislators to be experts on firearms.
Yeah, I think it's pretty difficult for a legislature or legislator to be knowledgeable about everything that they're expected to craft rules for, craft laws for. And I think that might be some of the inherent problems of just maybe the way our government's set up. But that's probably a conversation best saved for a later episode. So moving forward, I would like to keep an eye out for this. One thing I am increasingly interested about, and if anyone knows the answer to this, please email me at contact@howisthislegal.com. But I want to know what happens to the inventory that like Dick's and Walmart and these places have of assault rifles when they decide to stop selling them. I want to know if they sell through them, or do they sell them to another country? Do they claim it as a loss in their taxes? I'm really curious, and I can't find it anywhere. So if anyone knows that, I would really appreciate that information. And also, if any sort of gun laws are passed here in the next few months or the next year, love to have you back to sort of go over the new policies or whatever's being adopted and see if there's been some change for the better. But I do appreciate you taking the time to come on for the second time on the show, and I hope we get to do it again.
No problem. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you for listening to How Is This Legal? If you enjoyed the show, help others find us by clicking the subscribe button, leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcast, and sharing this podcast with your family and friends. Come back next time to find out how is this legal?